Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngau mai haere mai to Scan's first webinar. I have realised that the share screen is still on. So Jess, are you able to please unshare just temporarily? Thank you. Okay, so kia ora everyone. Welcome to our first ever Webhui. If I can all, I'm going to start with the karakia and then we will get into the hui. Tū tawa mai runga, tū tawa mai raro, tū tawa mai roto, tū tawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te mauritu ora ki te katoa. Haumie huie tākie. Welcome everyone. This, as I said before, this is our first online hui. So this is a trial. We're going to be pretty fluid. Don't have any high standards on the quality of this. We're going to do our very best, but it's our first attempt and we'll always improve over time. I want to first let you know, if you can all please turn off your cameras because it will just help in terms of recording, and it will just help to reduce the bandwidth. I really love to see all your lovely faces and it's so great to see them all here, but it would just really help us to make sure that things run as smoothly as possible from a technical perspective. And also just to let you know as well, it's being recorded just for anyone who's not been able to make it today. And I will also email you all a link to this recording as well as the link to the guide that Jess has put together. So what I'm going to do now is give a quick overview of what we're going to talk about and what it is. So this talk is about not just COVID-19, but the best way to talk about a crisis in a way that instills confidence and positivity in people rather than confusion and doubt and fear. And so I'm very, very pleased to welcome with great fullness Dr. Jess Berentson Shaw from the workshop. This hui is completely with thanks to the workshop, because they didn't charge us and that was wonderful, and we really, really appreciate that, and especially at this time. So Dr. Jess is a public narrative researcher and advisor, and she gained her PhD in health and psychology from Victoria University in 2003. In roles across government and for the not-for-profit sectors, she has focused on placing best knowledge and social equity in the heart of decision making. In 2017, she co-founded the workshop with Marianne Elliott, who you might know, I think it's from Action Station, correct me if I'm wrong. And now she's moved on to co-founded this. And now she researches communication and narrative strategies that engage deep in people's thinking and improve decision making. As well as that, she also teaches people, so researchers, policymakers and advocates, on how to change their stories and narratives to motivate action rather than kind of, yeah, just a story and then you can't do anything with it. So yeah, and she is author of an excellent, in my opinion, excellent book called A Matter of Fact, Talking Truth in a Post-Truth World, which was published in 2018 by Bridget Williams Books. And also, of course, this year she has published the How to Talk About COVID 2020 guide, which we will cover in this hui. So yeah, hey and all. Please give a warm welcome to Jess, and we can't applaud, but I will hand over to her now. Thank you, Jess. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Can everyone see me now? Great, excellent. Look, here I am in my bedroom. Look, that was a delightful introduction. Thanks so much, Laura. So I'm just going to crack into it. I'm going to share my screen now, and here we go with the presentation. And hopefully you can all see that. Laura, do you want to give me the thumbs up if that's working?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we quickly whipped together this guide on talking about COVID-19 once the rapidness of it all set in. A lot of this guide is based on existing research that we have done, plus research that's come from a lot of our sister organisations across the world, but also we did a rapid evidence review of communications during pandemics as well. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is actually the fundamental principles of how we teach strategic communication, with a little bit popped in there around COVID, and it'll just give you the basics and the kind of fundamental principles, and then you can go into the guide yourselves and have a look and explore it a little bit better. So here we go. Hopefully I'm gonna Here we go. Okay, so the workshop which I run with Marianne Elliott, as Laura said, is a public narrative organisation. And we came together really because we were, I guess, on different sides of the same mountain, where we could see that both great knowledge, I came from a policy and research background, care and good communication wasn't really translating into building the best systems that we weren't getting policies and practices that were building an inclusive society and that prioritised people and the planet. So we got a bit curious about that, I think, and thought, right, there's a gap here, and I'd written matter of fact, and we came together and thought that this is where the workshop can help with values and frames that can motivate change and embed good decision making in people. The research that we draw upon and the research we do ourselves and the practices we undertake are one tool in your toolkit as communicators and people who talk about science and evidence, and we draw primarily on Western bodies of research, including evidence-based healthcare, anthropology, cultural psychology, cognitive linguistics, implementation science, and storytelling traditions. And we offer our findings and understanding that there are many different ways of knowing, and that together it's those ways of knowing that offer us the greatest potential for building better systems. So it really is our intention that the work we do and the advice we offer is not treated as the answer, but rather a useful and helpful lens through which to approach how we talk about the big issues of our time. And some people, for instance, take our research and adapt it in ways that make sense in the context of their own ways of knowing. And we ourselves at the workshop are always curious and always learning. And that really defines a large part of why we do this work, because of what matters to us. And what matters to us really is this idea of curiosity about our infinitely wonderful world, and using the knowledge that's born of that curiosity to help build a society that's in service to people and the environment. So I'm going to start today with a little bit of why just talking about facts or telling great personal stories, two really common communication techniques, isn't as effective as we would like it to be to deepen people's thinking or to get best knowledge at the heart of our decision making. And you can see we've just got some objectives there, and usually I do this presentation in a day-long session. So bear with me, it'll be fast and rapid and a very high overview of some of these cognitive sciences. And I can hear my cats in the background battering the door down. I've got the children to leave the house, but such are our new challenges. Right, so why is it hard? I think for lots of us, we experience many barriers to getting knowledge at the heart of decision making and changing our systems to better reflect that knowledge. And some of those barriers exist in our own minds and approaches to communications, and some in our wider society. But the barriers that we see most commonly is really we have minds built to take shortcuts. And some of you might have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And what happens is we think fast when slow thinking would deepen our understandings. But fast thinking is a very adaptive and important part of our evolutionary process. So it's not to be seen as a bad thing, it is a thing. And it's, as communicators, it's something we need to learn to work with as opposed to against. One of those significant shortcuts that our brains take is that we tend to attribute cause and effect into relation to big complex issues, and many of us are working in complex areas, whether it's in the social sciences or in the hard physical sciences. We tend to ascribe these to what we can directly hear and see, a kind of sensory experience. And it leads us to think mainly about people's behaviour, or education is required in understanding complex problems. And I always think the classic here, example is that we have a housing system which is massively complex. It's made things incredibly difficult for people. And the solutions that people offer, or the explanations, is that we need to eat fewer avocados. And it's just my little joke that I make around how we often reach for behavioural solutions to complex systemic issues. One of the other shortcuts that we use is emotion. And emotion, I often say, is a traffic light to assessing how information fits with what we already know, instead of having to continually stop and reassess everything we know in the face of new information. And highly alarming information spreads far and fast, and it doesn't really slow our thinking down, which is obviously a challenge in the current crisis that we're facing. So those are kind of some of the internal barriers that we're facing. And the external ones are, we have a world that's really filled with so much information, and information that can be quite wrong. And for fast brains, which really helps us to survive in a hectic world, this makes it incredibly complex for people communicating complex, sophisticated, abstract information. And if good information isn't delivered in a way that takes our fast thinking brains into account, and advertisers have learned how to do this very well, or that information isn't effective at engaging our slow thinking systems, then there's less chance of it to be heard and taken on board. And the result really is that we have a dominant culture, and I talk very much about the dominant mainstream culture that's filled with quite shallow or unhelpful narratives that really don't help lift our gaze from that very behavioural level, that which we can see and hear, up to systems and structures, the things that are more invisible in our world. Dominant narratives that we see, and I'm sure you can think of a dominant narrative in your field as I'm talking about this, are often really simple, or they're quite wrong, and they don't match how experts, including those with lived experience, understand problems. And those default ways of thinking obviously can become quite common to us in our communications. And what happens is that these default or dominant models are exercised a lot more frequently. So they're like working a muscle, and it makes it hard for people to think differently. So structural and systems issues, or complex issues, or issues that require multiple different ways of thinking, don't get repeated as frequently. And there are quieter, more complex stories that people hold and understandings, but if they're recessive, then it can be quite hard to access them. And what we say at the workshop is that the dominant narratives really have the power to hold problematic, non-evidence-based systems in place, and have people looking in the hardest, least impactful places to change. And in the case of COVID-19, we see that there's a lot of examination of individual behaviour. And while individual behaviour is important, the systems and structures which actually determine our individual behaviour are far more important in the context of having a positive and useful response to COVID. Sorry, I'm just seeing if I can. Oops, I flipped through a few slides. Sorry about that. Okay. So as people who talk about complex issues, we ourselves are not immune to fast-thinking brains, and we tend to take a shortcut where we think that people assimilate new information and change their thinking by being filled up with good information. And that's called the information deficit model. And it assumes if we talk loudly enough about good information, people will hear us and act. However, if we operate under this model, then the way we talk and communicate doesn't penetrate those deeper cultural narratives, and it doesn't deepen how people understand an issue. And we can even inadvertently be reinforcing dominant narratives if we're not paying attention to how people are actually thinking about an issue, or what the dominant narratives might be. So as part of the guide, what we put together was, with help from organisations across the world, were some analysis of the ways that people are thinking about COVID, and some of the dominant or unhelpful narratives that are out there, and also the types of thinking that we want to engage instead. So I've just got some examples up here of what we're seeing, and these are just a couple, and you can go to the guide and have a look at some of the other ones. But For example, some of the unhelpful thinking that we're seeing is around this idea that the virus originated in China because Chinese handled it badly. And you'll hear that in some of the narratives, even from people like Donald Trump. And the kinds of thinking, we don't want to engage that type of thinking. The kinds of thinking we want to engage for better decision making is that this is a global crisis that affects us all and it has no borders. How do we feel we'll cope about it? The types of thinking that we see dominating and come up quite frequently are some of these fatalistic views, that there's no alternatives for actions, that governments will respond poorly. And I have to say that that fatalistic way of thinking about things is very common across all the areas that we research, especially this idea that we can't do anything about it. But what we need people to be thinking about is that we can and should take action, we can stop the spread, we can flatten the curve. And so knowing that there are these two different ways of thinking, then we actually have to plan our communications around trying not to engage in unhelpful or dominant narratives and more surfacing some of these more helpful ways of thinking. So what I'm going to talk about now is, hopefully if my screen works for me. Slow. Here we go, is how we do that. And we have a strategic approach to communications, what we call the 5 building blocks, is how we can deepen people's thinking, how we can get them to put good evidence and good knowledge at the heart of their decision making. And I'm just very quickly going to go through these today as to cover those building blocks, and you can look in the guide again for more information on these. But see, these 5 building blocks, the first is about knowing who you're talking to. Second's about having a concrete vision for a better world, and I'll talk about why we often leave this part out. The importance of tapping into what we call intrinsic values. So those are values that are really about our collective well-being and our environmental well-being. The need to provide better explanation. So that's the how things happen, and the importance of trusted messengers. So I just meant to say actually that all of our illustrations are done by our illustrator Megan Salol, and she does a wonderful job of really getting to the heart of what we're trying to convey. And this picture always makes me laugh a little bit. So what we've got, the way that we define our audience in the workshop is very much based on, not on demographics, but based on how people are currently sitting and thinking about an issue. So it's very much based on current understandings that people hold, as opposed to who they are or who they vote for or where they live. And there are 3 main groups that we talk about. There's your base, and those are people who are on board. These are people who often understand science, highly value science, for example, and they see government as relatively trusted and scientists as trustworthy people as well. And these people will amplify any great message that you have, but they will also amplify any not particularly well-constructed message that you have. So you have to think about what you are constructing and giving to your base. At the other end, you've got this nice man in a tie. He is your hard to persuade, and they are people who generally will be in a situation where they have pre-made up their mind, and they are either not particularly inclined to think about science institutions as trustworthy, or the government is trustworthy, or they might just have particularly strong views. Now, those people we often find are very noisy, especially in an age of social media. And we spend a lot of time engaging with those, trying to convince those people. They're a minority. And when we spend time talking to those people or constructing our narratives to convince those people, and often we're in a situation where our organizations feel like we need to deal with those people, is that we waste our time and energy and precious resources on people who are very hard to shift. Because the majority of the population on any one issue will usually sit in the middle. They'll be what we call fence sitters. They don't have particularly strong views one way or another. And those are the people we need to be speaking to, because they can be pulled in either direction by both a very strong, pervasive story from the hard to persuade or from the base. And frankly, what I found when thinking about this and when I looked at the research on this was it was a relief. It was a relief that I didn't need to anymore spend all of my time and energy trying to persuade hard to persuade groups. What happens when we also spend time with those hard to persuade is that we end up repeating problematic narratives. So dominant narratives get exercised more by us, the people who are trying to do the good work of changing those narratives. So that's an important kind of ethical issue around why we might not want to be communicating with those hard to persuade people too often, because we can end up repeating dominant narratives when we're trying to create new ones. Okay, a vision for a better future. It's often when we're people who work in science, we work in policy, or the issues that we experience are ones that we have lived experience of, and we perhaps feel a great sense of injustice, as we spend a lot of time leading with the problems, which is really natural. But one of the things about leading with problems is it's very hard to engage persuadable people who might not be convinced already or might not have lived experience of an issue. So we say that leading with a vision opens a side door for people in the persuadable group to really think about and consider in easier ways, I guess, the issues that you're about to present them with. And one of the kind of little tips that we talk about when we talk about flipping or starting with a vision is you can flip your problems into vision. So you can take your problem and turn that into the vision of a better world. And sometimes we talk about this as leading with the cakes, not the ingredients. The cake is the picture that you get on the front of the box that you're presenting to people, and the ingredients, so how we get there, are something that you see on the back of the box. So once somebody has seen the cake that they want to bake or they want to eat, then you can come in with your ingredients. By leading with a vision, we also avoid myth busting, which again is one of those problematic things which can end up repeating some of the dominant narratives or some of those dominant ways of thinking that we don't want to be giving more airtime to. And we have that picture of Martin Luther King mainly there because the powerful speech that he gave, and if you go and you read that speech in detail, he did a beautiful job of articulating in really concrete ways not just what he didn't want America to be, but what he wanted it to be and what a better future would look like, and how that invited so many people into the conversation. So vision making is really critical. A couple of aspects of vision making that's important to remember is making it as concrete as you can. So I'm just aware of my time, so I'm just going to keep flicking through. The third aspect of our strategic communications is really connecting with the why or the values of life. So values are guiding principles. They tend to be relatively stable. They're different from behaviors and beliefs, which can be a poor proxy for the values we hold most dear. And I think of values as the sorts of things we might think about mattering to us at the end of our lives when we look back and consider what it is that we've done or the legacy that we want to leave. And values are really critical in opening a conversation with people on the basis of what matters to them. Look, there's far too much to go into on values today, but there are really 4 key points. Is that we're not led by logic, which can be a hard thing, I think, especially for us scientists to hear, but we're led and motivated by what matters most, and that informs our beliefs and sparks our emotions and our feelings. And even belief in science is actually about what matters to us. When we believe in science or we understand or follow science, it's often because creativity, wisdom, and curiosity are values and things that really matter to us. Feelings, like I said, are the brain's traffic light system, telling us whether information fits with what matters to us. And opening a conversation with what matters to people opens a side door for them to consider the information in the light of what they care about. But really importantly, if we want to achieve collective action for systems change or any kind of collective, we're trying to convey collective evidence or evidence for collective well-being, then not just any values will do. And what I'm showing you here is the Common Cause Values Map. And this is a map that was put together by the Common Cause Network based on research by a guy called Shalom Schwartz, who's a cultural psychologist. It's very much seen it through a Western lens of the universal values that are seen to recur across cultures and across societies. And importantly, this map actually shows the spectrum, not just the spectrum of values which humans tend to hold, and you might recognize values which you feel important in there, but also the relationship that values have with each other. So it's actually a relational map. And those values that are closer to each other. So I'll take, for example, if you look in the benevolence group, you'll see that being responsible is there, and you'll see next to it is loyalty. And that means that if I prioritize responsibility, I'm more likely to also prioritize loyalty. What the values research shows us is that we tend to all hold all of these values. I hold both achievement values and universalism values, but that we're more likely to strongly prioritize one value over another. And because of the statistical nature that I've just described to you, is that we can't tend to not prioritize values that are far away from each other at any one time. It's very difficult for me to prioritize achievement values at the same time that I'm prioritizing my universalism values, and we call that the seesaw effect. And that's, you'll see why that's particularly important as I talk on a little bit further. These values are can be grouped down into a more simplistic way into what we would call intrinsic values and extrinsic values. Intrinsic values, I just like to point out here that it's only social psychologists would use a word, that two words that sound almost identical to describe what are quite two different things. But intrinsic values are those things where what matters to us is we get kind of internal feel-good rewards for it, and extrinsic values are where we get external rewards for it. So the why we act is because there's some material or external kind of reward that we get from it. And it's not that some values are good or some values are bad, just that different values give us different things. So what I'm showing you now is really a kind of a map, I guess, of the large body of research, both experimental and observational, that has found that depending on the group of values that are prioritized by both individuals and cultures, there's an increased likelihood of specific actions being taken. So if our culture prioritizes intrinsic values, we see more interest in pro-environmental behaviors, activism, volunteering, donating, interest in big issues. And if our public discourse and our individual responses reinforce extrinsic values, then we tend to see more of the kind of types of behaviours which we would think are not particularly useful for collective well-being. And you'll see that there's in one of the blue triangles something called a security value. That's when what matters to us is keeping ourselves or our communities safe. So there's a lot of fear driving what matters to us. And when fear drives what matters to us, then we tend to see both the types of unhelpful collective behaviours, plus also an intolerance for anything that's ambiguous. So we tend not to want to think in complex ways when what matters to us is safety. And you can start to see how that might have an influence in times of a global pandemic. So too long didn't read version is that intrinsic values, when they are prioritised, they're helpful to collective goals and well-being, both environmental well-being and us as a collective. And when extrinsic values are prioritised, they're quite helpful to us as individuals, and they tend to help us meet our individual goals. So what do New Zealanders value? Well, research from around the world in New Zealand has shown that people tend to hold quite a mixture of these values, but they dispositionally prioritise those intrinsic ones, which is good news. We tend to be benevolent and universalist, so you can see that security does come up there in terms of what matters to us. So in that case, if we all prioritise these great collective, benevolent, universalist values, how come we're still working in lots of areas where people are not prioritising the types of actions or the types of science, or they're not putting best knowledge for collective well-being at the heart of their decision making? That's because how we act is is affected by how we perceive others' values. And while we might all aspire to intrinsic collective values, so those values that we hold most dear, when we ask other people, like they did in the study in the UK, what they think everybody else aspires to, there's a massive perception gap. We all aspire as ourselves to the kind of collective well-being, intrinsic values, the things that are inherently good, but we think that nobody else does. And that's because cultural context matters. And if what we see around us and the way of life constantly being engaged in our dominant narratives are extrinsic values, then this large perception gap opens up, and we don't tend to behave or bring to the fore our most deeply held intrinsic values when we're making decisions. And the dominant narrative about what matters or what matters to us most influences the values we bring to talking and deciding about complex issues. And Western culture, if you think about it, is full of stories telling us to prioritize ourselves as individuals, money, power, success. And it leaves us feeling quite hopeless and like no one cares about collective issues. And you constantly see that, for example, in climate change research. I care about climate change, but I don't believe that we'll act to do anything about it. And in any kind of crisis, be it pandemic or climate change, we get a lot of security values being engaged as well. And that's where we're told that what matters to us is the stuff about keeping us safe, and that's going to be quite terrifying. And the problem with being scared or having values of security engaged is that we reach for these oversimplistic and individualistic solutions. We tend to close down and think about what can I do to protect myself, but not anyone else. And if you think about it, there's probably a good evolutionary perspective to that. When our ancestors were running away from a saber-toothed tigers, we didn't want to stop and think in more complex ways about how we could run away. We just wanted to think about running away faster. So the kind of take-home message here really is that we need to shift our narrative to shift the values context. We're often trained to meet people where we're at, but if the values context is one of extrinsic values, then that's not going to be much use to us. So people hold many values and they sit in many places at once, but they most deeply prioritize values are intrinsic ones: care for each other, care for the environment, creativity, innovation. And our job often as strategic communicators is to guide people towards their existing helpful values. And frankly, I find that a relief, because that means we can talk to those things which actually matter most to us as communicators as well, and see it in other people. So what I've got here is just an extract from the guide around what are the sorts of values that we can bring to the COVID discussion. And we can see that, and I think you would have heard in a lot of the conversation, economic values being engaged a lot, where money, growth and financial loss is what matters most. Now, obviously, we want to try and avoid that. These are not values that help us think about collective well-being. Rather, we need to think about embracing values around helpfulness, care and honesty. And in New Zealand, we're pretty lucky. We see that that is going on a lot from our leaders. Cooperation and interconnectedness, but also for people in the science frame, responsibility and pragmatism are really useful values, and innovation to embrace as well. And again, if you go to the guide, you'll see that there's a lot more examples of the types of values that we want to engage, but also how we might phrase that and the kinds of language that we might use in order to engage some of those helpful intrinsic values and when our communications around COVID. Oh, sorry. There we go. So I think for lots of you leading communications with the why that matters, that's already something you would have heard or had experience of. And I think we are in an environment at the moment where we are getting better at using some of our intrinsic values to communicate with. And our research tells us that values are really, really important. They're the first side door to open, because values are at the heart of our motivations, but we can't stop there. What we also need is understanding how, or what we call better explanations. And explanations matter very much to those of us working in complex issues, and they're really important for deepening people's thinking. What tends to happen is that our explanations are often a little bit too shallow, or they're limited to taking a few kind of strategies. And one of them is, excuse me, I'm just going to mute myself. One of them is we tend to either explain the problem with our facts over and over again, or we spend a lot of time negating and myth busting other people's stories. And because of that dominant narrative issue, you can see how that can start to further embed some of the unhelpful thinking that we want. And what we want to do, our positive strategy, is to overcome some of those deeply embedded dominant narratives and shallow ways of thinking, and put in their place some of the deeper ways of thinking. But if people think fast, and we've talked about people taking lots of mental shortcuts, then our better explanations need to encompass effective simplifying models. We can't just tell people what the good science is in kind of complex ways if people are thinking fast. We need to create an invitation really for people to slow down their thinking. And I guess what I would say here is that explaining is very different from describing a problem. And we tend to get stuck on describing a problem, again, because it matters quite deeply to us, or we feel a sense of injustice or a sense of frustration. And at the beginning, what I didn't talk about, but I had in my first slide, is that I got into this work primarily because of my deep frustration about not getting evidence into policy making. Frames really are a cognitive shortcut, and I talk about frames a little bit, but again, they're very deep, and I encourage you to go back to some of our other work to understand a little bit more about frames. But they are cognitive shortcuts we use to understand complex issues without having to re-review everything we know about the world. You'll hear other words like mental models or heuristics or cultural models to describe frames, and they tend to be shared across cultures. And again, there are dominant frames. And the takeaway from that is, without understanding frames, we often inadvertently frame unhelpful explanations to try and re-explain our problem or solution. And that doesn't really lift people's gaze to systems change or some of the more complex issues that we are trying to explain to people. What we need to do instead is to use new, more helpful frames, which as a simplifying model. And what I'm showing you here, hopefully if my computer will catch up. Just give it a little, I've flicked all the way to the end, sorry about that. Some of the frames that we see that we want to avoid engaging for COVID is the crisis and the panic frame. So people are selfish and panicking and it's only going to get worse. Again, so you might have seen some of our communications around discouraging too much focus on people who aren't keeping to the rules of lockdown. And that's because that tends to engage that dominant frame around panic or crisis of not coping. And instead what we want to do is embrace frames of solidarity and independence. Us versus them. So that's a frame that we see where there are other people over there who are going to get sick. It's not going to affect me. And we really create a dividing line in our frames between who is going to get sick and who's not going to get ill from COVID. And that's something we really don't want to engage. Rather, instead, we want a frame of the public or the common good, which is that COVID is something that's going to affect us all, no matter who we are, and a strong and prepared health system with health care staff who have breathing space to care for us. That sort of frame is a much more helpful frame for engaging people in the types of collective action that we need them to engage in. So, my computer's just slowing down a little bit, sorry about this. So metaphors are another simplifying cognitive linguistic model that we can use to help explain something that's complex or abstract. It has a source and a domain. So we take something which we understand in an everyday sense and we attach it to the complex thing to help people understand using their fast thinking brain. And the example that I've got here, and I use quite a lot, is the two different ways that we use metaphors to explain the economy. We either explain it as a natural force or a storm to be weathered. And when we use that type of metaphor to explain the economy, people can't see how humans are responsible for setting the rules of the economy. They feel fatalistic and it engages types of thinking that we don't want to. When we use, so I've got a bus there, when we use mechanical metaphors like we're driving the economy, then it starts to engage people in this idea that it's possible to do something. Humans can actually control the rules that we set around the economy, for example. And the types of metaphors in COVID that we see coming up, and again, my computer's just slowing down. We see a lot of war and disaster metaphors, which is really natural, but they're quite unhelpful because they tend to create the types of explanation, again, which there is a them and an us, and it doesn't really embrace these ideas of collective explanations or collective responses. And so the sorts of metaphors that we've got in that guide that we might like to embrace, and these are just a couple of examples, are journeys and navigation, challenges, and you can see that that can actually really get people thinking in a less panicked way, a less agitated or anxious way, and thinking about how we can work together. It also engages more thinking about equity, which is a really important conversation that we need to be having during COVID, and thinking about COVID responses. And so you can again go and look in the guide for some more of those metaphors that we suggest are useful. Facts, using facts, I'm not going to go into it too much, except to say that facts are a character in the story. They're not the story itself. Leading with our facts doesn't engage people in deeper thinking. It won't overcome some of those dominant narratives. And they don't replace an existing explanation or existing frame. So in the guide, we've got something called explanatory chains, which are a little simplifying method, again, that you can use to explain some of the complex science that we are learning about on an everyday basis with COVID. And they have what we would call, they lead people into the how, as opposed to just describing the problem. And I think that explanatory chains are very useful when we're in an area constantly needing to describe new science every day to people who are having a lot of information thrown at them. And messengers matter. And one of the things can be quite difficult about messengers is that expertise doesn't matter as much as people's perceptions of expertise. And what I mean when I say that is influential people in any community can be seen as experts, whether they hold scientific knowledge or actual expertise. And that can really work in our favor as well. If we use a wide range of messengers using effective narratives, then we can actually reach more people. And this is particularly important if we're thinking about communication from an equity point of view. So who's getting to hear the information and who needs the information most? So we can think about messengers who are well qualified to comment in the context of the message, but also messengers who are influential within the communities that we want to reach. Finding unexpected messengers is also a really interesting approach, because if we can find messengers that align to persuadable people's values especially. So an example of that is when conservative politicians might be talking about caring for the community which they exist in, might be something which is surprising to people. And just remembering, of course, that trust in governments, institutions or expertise may have been considerably eroded in some groups through previous action or inaction or previous experience. And what we see from the research is trust during pandemics can be rebuilt in these institutions using an equity lens, so driving decision-making through an equity lens, but also using caring and empathy in communications. And I might just quickly say that this is what I've presented in a very quick overview, and I just want to give everybody time for questions, is complex stuff, and that there are lots of skills to be learnt, which we teach, but that this is just a quick overview of the types of skills that we can learn as strategic practitioners in communicating our science. And then my last slide is just some resources for you of both the guide. We do weekly newsletters on COVID because things are changing so quickly. We're developing a one-page checklist, and then this book, and there are other guides on climate change, for example, on our website. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and right, here we go.
I'm just going to, kia ora, thank you very much, Jess. I'm just checking whether my screen is actually, yes, okay, we're back on there. We've got a couple of questions they just came in just now. The first one, we were going to directly message you then, but there are two different ones, one for myself. But it would be great if anyone else has any questions. Now is your time to share them on the chat. You can just do it publicly. We have one from David Eccles, which says, The hard to persuade group frequently talks about money as the most valuable thing. I found it difficult to counter because money is a single tangible thing. Do you have any advice on how to reduce the money narrative and emphasize other values?
Yep. So the reason that persuadable group grabs the money thing is because the opposition groups using money a lot as framing, and also because of that cultural context which I talked about, which is that we are surrounded by monetary values. So really the goal is, and why we call it common cause, is because if we as communicators can build I guess a flotilla, it's a bit of a movement around intrinsic values, then people will grab less easily to the monetary values and those individualistic values. And, you know, I would say that in our research, so we're actively doing research and randomized control trials, when we use intrinsic values, we shift, and we do see people shift. We see their understanding of complexity deepen, and we see them move towards more collective responses when we offer them solutions.
Thank you. You have a lot of experience and a big team behind you on, you know, looking at a situation and being able to identify what values fit best with intrinsic and everything. So I suppose my question for you would be, are there, it's kind of related to David's previous question about money being a negative value that probably would apply across most crises. But what about other values? I'm trying to think of, like, let's say if there's an earthquake or something, what commonalities would there be in this crisis versus an earthquake one, for example?
Yeah, well, you can already see that there's a huge, especially in New Zealand, I don't know if it's so much happening overseas, but people are talking a lot about collective values. And I have to say, for me, I've been doing this work for a few years now, and often I will say to people, look, from the research, we can see that people deeply prioritize these intrinsic, interconnected collective values. And people are like, really? Do they? And there has been a massive shift through COVID. I've seen this massive shift to people talking constantly about collective values. Like, it's quite amazing to me. And people who lived through Christchurch would have seen it as well, I'm sure. So you can see very quickly at a time of crisis, the types of things that come up are the things that matter most to people. Yes, you have extrinsic values around the economics and money and fear, but you can see very powerfully how people are talking about a lot of the collective values.
Thank you, Jess. If anyone has any other questions, please do put them in the chat. Hoping there's a couple more. I think one of the things that I've noticed is it's quite high level, so it's quite a different way of thinking for, you know, people like me who just communicate, you know, on social media on a day-to-day basis, and, you know, you're trying to put out this message, and then you get somebody who is one of these hard to convert people who is just like, no, and they basically hijack your whole social media thread or something. I've been lucky to have that not happen to me, but I know that that will or might happen for some people, especially people working in healthcare or anything else. What's your thoughts on how to deal with those kind of things?
Yeah, so I think it's always good. I have a relatively large Twitter following, which attracts some of those types. So it's been a great process for me to learn how to manage that. Some of it is just not engaging because that's a repetition. So reminding ourselves that by engaging, we are amplifying a narrative that we don't want to. And then some of the other strategies that I use is to going back to the values, going constantly back to what matters. I do this work because I'm curious, because I want that curiosity to inform best knowledge. And that can be a way to de-escalate some of those conversations as well. I'm not saying it's easy, but definitely what I've seen happen in one-on-one or in group situations where people are getting agitated, then when you take it back to a value or about what matters, so we had a conversation about planetary boundaries, which I was in, and there were different factions, kind of, I guess I would describe it, when we took the conversation back to what we had in common, the intrinsic values, then it de-escalated a lot of that conversation quite nicely, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, we do have some more questions. Hooray. So we have from Stacey, in times like these, do you think there is any room to tie the current crisis with others? So for example, biodiversity, climate change, or is it all just too much for people to take in?
Yes is the short answer, and there's some stuff in the guide actually which will help you there around how do we talk about transforming systems within the context of COVID. I think what we're seeing is that people are naturally thinking about, hey, if we can change so much so quickly in the face of this crisis, then there's an existing crisis that's still there around climate change. I think possibly there's a timing issue with it as well. I think probably within give it another week or two and people will start to be having more conversations about how do we transform our systems. But absolutely, this is an opportunity for us to think about how do we build systems in which are resilient to the inevitable crisis. This is not a one-off thing. It's not going to, humans aren't suddenly going to become in a situation once COVID goes away where we're never going to experience any crisis again. So there is absolutely, and I would encourage people to start having conversations around how we can transform our systems.
We have a couple of questions that are similar. One is from, I'm trying to find it. Yeah, one is from Maureen and the other is from Rob. I will say them both at the same time. So Maureen asked, do you think that the narrative will shift back to extrinsic values as the crisis abates? How can we encourage the carryover of intrinsic values as we move ahead? And from Rob, how do we keep people focused on intrinsic values after the immediate threat has passed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cultural climate, the dominant narratives are dominant for a reason. And so, and even now you can see that dominant narrative trying to exert itself through our economic framing. And so, yeah, it will continue to exert itself. And the other thing to think about here is power, actually, and who holds power and what kind of narratives serve them. So, yep, they'll keep trying to exert themselves as they always have. And the job, or what I see our job is to do as strategic communicators, is to keep ourselves very firmly on focusing on building a movement around intrinsic values and leading with intrinsic values, even when it feels uncomfortable to us. And certainly within our communications, we see it works. I mean, that's what gives me hope, is that when we lead with intrinsic values and we test our strategies and our narratives, they work.
Great, thank you. The questions are coming thick and fast, which is great. So we have from Vanessa, you mentioned that how we act is determined by how we think other values are, or what we think other people's values are. Why do you think this, that we have such different expectations of others' motivations? It seems that we have such low expectations of others.
Yeah. And again, that comes back to the dominant narratives. And we think about the way that we are constantly manipulated. We have an information environment that is saturated a lot of the time with people trying to sell us stuff, to be honest. We live in a world in which most of the information that we see on an everyday level is controlled by people who are trying to sell us goods, and they are constantly engaging us in types of extrinsic values. So I think, and then that's a Western thing for sure. And so, it does create, like I said, this perception gap. And often what we're looking for is social proof that other people do care. So it's really important sometimes to be those people that get on the dance floor first, if you will, because that provides social proof that other people care.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Emma. What are the best ways to identify the trusted messengers within a community? So who can assist in communicating our messages?
Yeah, and that's tricky. Can be a tricky one, Emma, because it actually requires that we usually have more diversity and inclusion than we usually have in a lot of our institutions, because it's through relationships often that we will know who trusted messengers are. Having said that, you can test a messenger. There are different ways that you can test with how a messenger lands with people as well. I do take some heart from the fact that during a crisis in which science is really being brought to the fore, like it has in COVID, then we are seeing that kind of traditional experts, scientists, for example, are being trusted more.
In that sense, I have a question from Maurice. I'm not quite sure in what context he meant it, but he just said, how do we begin these conversations? So I'm not sure whether that is in reference to within the community or others, but I suppose it's, yeah, how do we just get started on having the right conversations with people? What's the best way to do that?
I think it depends. So if I was to answer in the context of kind of public communications and public narratives, then it's just starting experimenting with leading your communications with values and vision and seeing how it lands. And that's certainly something that I've just taught myself to do and practiced in my everyday kind of work for the last few years. And if we're talking on an interpersonal level, then I would say just experiment, start talking about what matters, think about what your own values are, spend some time thinking about the things that really matter to you and really engaging. It's a bit of a practice. Sometimes it can feel a bit uncomfortable because we're not used to a lot of those collective values sometimes being engaged, but I'd certainly say after a point of time it becomes, as I said in the presentation, it becomes a relief actually to start talking about the things that matter to you most, knowing that other people actually care about that stuff too.
Thank you. So I believe that's questions from everyone, and that pretty much concludes our hui. I hope that you all enjoyed it. It's the first, hopefully, of many. We will. I will send out the link to the booklet, the guide developed by Jess and the workshop with the awesome illustrators. There's all the illustrations are in the guide as well, so it's a nice read. Thank you again so much to Jess and especially the workshop for doing this. It's been fantastic. We are recording this, as I said before, so we will send out a link to you to this video. And also, if you don't mind, everyone, if you can please fill out just a short survey just to let us know what you thought and whether this is something that you would like to see happen more in the future. So on that note, it's exactly 1:30 and I don't want to keep you. We all have busy lives at home. It's very strange doing this from home, but I'm quite happy with how this has gone. So right, I will just finish with a karakia and then we will all be able to go. So thank you. Ka whakaira ke te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tura ki whakatahi ai, kia tura ki whakatahi ai. Haumie, huie, taiki e, ngā mihi, mai wa.